I'm wearing a hat that Rondi and I got when we were in Israel last month. We spent 3 weeks in Israel. Um, at one point, we were at a kibbutz named Kfar Aza, which is right near Gaza, and it was difficult emotionally. There's a man who returns there every day in search of his son's head, and we we attended a number of rallies uh, in support of those who are family members of ours who are seeking a change in the government, who don't feel um, protected by the government. And anyway, one of these rallies got one of these hats. It's from Kfar Aza. It says "Bring them home." On the other side, it has the name of uh, Ziv and Gali. Or their last name is Berman. They're 26-year-old twins who were abducted on October the 7th from Kfar Aza. These hats have lots of names on the backs, and the one I got has those twins on the back. It's just a small way of remembering them. We don't know if they're still alive. Um, I want to welcome everybody to our July 2024 book program. It's our seventh monthly book program of the year and the 15th in a series that began last year. Our group was founded in 1979, which makes us one of the first organizations of its kind. We don't have dues or officers, but we do have a passion for truth and a bond formed by shared experience. If you are a child of survivors and you live in the Philadelphia area or in Melbourne, and you're interested in joining our group, please leave a note in the chat, and we'll be delighted to welcome you. We're an active and vibrant organization, and these free monthly Zoom programs are recorded, and they can be found within a day or two on my YouTube channel, which is shown in the chat area. This program will be available there tomorrow. As it happens, this program will be our last book program for a while. The series is taking a breather, but it will be back. And when that happens, you all will be the first to know. Tonight's guest is a 3G. He's not a 2G, he's a 3G. He's a grandson of survivors. His name is Menachem Kaiser, and he is one of the most exciting and eloquent voices, in my estimation, to appear on the scene in a very long time. As you read this memoir, you are aware on almost every page that you're also reading a carefully crafted work of art. And so he knows, because I had a chance to chat with him before we started here, he knows that I'm impressed. He's coming to us tonight from upstate New York. He lives in Brooklyn. He grew up in an Orthodox milieu in Toronto, and he'll be talking to us about his critically acclaimed 2021 book, Plunder, a memoir of family property and Nazi treasure, for which he received the 2022 Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, administered by the National Library of Israel. It's the story of his quest to reclaim his family's apartment building in Sosnowiec, Poland, and of his astonishing entanglement with bounty hunters. But it's much more than that. It's also about a memoir written by the brother of his grandfather. And I am going to ask everyone to put questions in the chat area, because Menachem told me he's looking forward to a lively Q&A. And if you'd rather just speak, you can speak. Now I'm going to make Menachem the host so that he can give a little overview for those who have not read the book, how it came about. He's got some extraordinary slides that he's going to share with us, and he'll talk about what has happened in the 3 years since its publication. And with that, I will turn it over to Menachem.
It's good. We're good. Yeah.
We are good.
Well, David, it's very kind. It's very flattering. I guess I would ask the rest of you if he's this nice to the other guests, or if I'm graded on a curve. It's really fun to be here. I've done a lot of book events. It's tailing off now, but almost always my favorite ones have been with groups like yours, like people who have a sort of a personal commitment to the cause. And so I'm very honored that you guys invited me to speak to you. And so I'm assuming most of you have not read my book. I'm not offended. That's correct. People are nodding, but I don't know if that means I'm correct in my assumption or that you have read my book. So you haven't read my book, and now it will nod again. Okay, so it's still confusing, but I'm just going to assume people haven't. So I'll briefly explain it. It's a little bit of a strange and kind of sprawling story. And I will say, like, if you're curious about anything at all, please ask. If you're curious about like particular plot points, I'll probably just answer you. You should ask anyways, and I'll probably just say it's in the book, which is not me trying to pitch it anymore at this point. It's really like a marginal gain, but you should read it because it's fun, I think. So the book is basically follows, I would say, two narratives that start kind of separate, that get kind of entangled surprisingly. And I say that surprisingly even to me, as they both happened to me, and even a kind of as a writer, it got surprisingly entangled. The first one was, the headline was my attempts to reclaim an apartment building that belonged to my grandfather. And so, just because this is for the right crowd to explain my background. So as David mentioned, my grandfather and my grandmother were Holocaust survivors. These were my father's parents. But unlike, I think a lot of my peers, my fellow quote unquote 3G peers, this was not like a major part of my Jewish identity. And so it wasn't like I didn't think of myself as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. Part of this was because every person, almost quite literally every single person I knew, was a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. I grew up in an Orthodox home, in an Orthodox community. I did not know any non-Jews. I barely knew any non-religious Jews. And the community in Toronto was, by and large, founded by Holocaust survivors. So it was way more common for someone, my friends, grandparents, at least one, if not 3 or 4 grandparents to be survivors. And this might sound odd coming from someone who wrote a book about it, but I wasn't that curious about it. My grandfather died before I was born. He died in 1977, and my family's actually not great at telling stories. And so, and I'm named after him also, so I was his namesake. So I heard about him, but in the most general, vague sense. I really didn't have a sense of who he was. And I certainly didn't have a sense of his Holocaust history. And my father, he's like an interesting guy, but he sort of didn't pass on this, I would call it like Holocaust responsibility. And I think that this is an interesting conversation. Why? But like I easily could have gone my entire life without looking into it. There was no pressure to go to Poland. There was no pressure to learn more about this story. Part of that is because it was lost. My grandparents died before they spoke about it. And so no one knew any details and no one was really all that curious. And so when I was 25 years old, I got a Fulbright fellowship to Lithuania, where I have no family connection. There was nothing there for me. I was actually pursuing Yiddish as kind of like a subject. But that was my first taste of Eastern Europe. And I found it sort of kind of, I would say, overwhelmingly interesting. I had sort of learned Holocaust history the same way most like Jewish day school students learn. So I found it to be sort of an important, but like sort of difficult to appreciate the stakes. But once I was there in Lithuania, sort of became alive. I ended up living in the Vilna ghetto without realizing I was living in the Vilna ghetto. It was actually pointed out to me by a German tourist. And I got very, very involved. And so my first sort of big Eastern European project was I built a map of the Vilna ghetto, like a digital map. I became a tour guide. I found the questions to be so challenging and interesting, and geographical, to understand where something happened, what actually happened in this space. So this part's actually not in the book because it's just a very funny and strange story. That year, it's a long story, involves falafel, but I ended up meeting a Brooklyn chassid in Vilnius in like March. In March, you do not meet many American tourists in Vilnius. But one day I met this guy who was he had like, payas. He was wearing a weed shirt, a Bob Marley shirt in Hebrew. And he was a very interesting guy, turned out to be the road manager for the Scorpions, like the German supergroup, like Rock You Like a Hurricane and Winds of Change. And so he was the road manager. And so I ended up helping the Scorpions, with their hotel. And then I actually took them to karaoke. That's a whole where I begged them to sing their own songs, but they refused. And my friend, this Hasidic guy, his name's Yaakov. His father is the chief rabbi of Galicia, which is, it's why does Galicia, which is a region that no longer exists, have a chief rabbi? It's a good question. Doesn't matter right now. He has a chief rabbi. So he invited me to come to Poland for the first time for that Rosh Hashanah. And all of which is to say, the first time I went to Poland, which is where my family was from, I went with no sense of like a familial story. It was pretty much as far as you could get from like a roots trip. But while I was there, I went to Krakow for a few weeks. And while I was there, I was like, you know what? I'm here. I'm in Poland. I'm in Krakow. Let me go visit my grandfather's hometown. And so I called my dad. I said, what's the city? He said, it's in Sosnowiec. I was like, oh, do you have an address? And he sort of read out this address to me, which was very difficult to spell. And I got on a couple of trains and I went to visit this building, this apartment building. And my father was like, that's where he grew up. And, I took some photos. I snuck in. I had this sort of like this sentimental moment with it. And I felt like very connected. And then I left. And I really had no reason to believe I would ever return, just because it felt like an obligation that I had fulfilled. And so I wasn't really working with any questions then. And I didn't really know how to construct those questions. But then, I found Poland to be maybe the most interesting. I started researching questions about I would call it the intersection of history and politics and Jewish identity. And I found Poland to be the most interesting place in the world to pursue questions like this. And so my projects, even if they were in Lithuania, I would make Poland my base. And for the next 5 years, I spent 2 or 3 months each year in Poland, sort of either writing or researching, doing various projects. And over that time, my dad sort of kept bugging me. He sort of kept nudging me. He was like, oh, you're spending all this time in Poland. you know that building, we used to own it. That building belonged to my grandfather. He tried to reclaim it for 30 years. He never got anywhere. I have all these documents. I don't know what any of these mean. You're spending all that time there. Go look into it. And so it never really felt like a question of urgency. But Adele, one day my father got tired of how lazy I was being, and he just faxed me all these pages. And so that was the moment where sort of like it kicked off. When I'm reading those pages, I picked them up from Hotel Eden, like one summer night in Krakow, and I read those pages. And that moment, my grandfather came alive. I don't really know how to say it without sounding a little sentimental, but he came alive because I could see that he had tried and failed to reclaim this building. And like the way I read in the book, as failure is a perch for the imagination. Like I was able to visualize him. It was sort of something, it imposed an emotion on this character that I never really had a grasp on before. And I was like fortunate enough to be in a position where I could pick up where he left off. And so I found a lawyer. The lawyer seems to be everyone's favorite character in the book. She's a woman. I don't know how old she is, somewhere between like 80 and 130 years old. She's called the Killer. That's how she was introduced to me. She's known as the Killer. She wore like incredible velour tracksuits and just obsessed with cats. Like, if you walk into their office, it would be the calendars were cats, the posters were cats, the screensavers were cats. They would give me my legal documents in cat folders. And I'm like, these are the best lawyers ever. I'm in. And so that sort of like kicked off my journey to attempt to reclaim. And so that is an overview of chapter 1. And so that's sort of like the intro to like what this book is about. And so this is like one of the 2 narratives is my attempts to reclaim this building. And in one part of that is sort of the legal bureau, like the legal maze, and that it's going, it ended up being, I had to prove, this is like a little bit of a spoiler, but it's 3 years after the books come out. So, yeah, it's your fault, not my fault. That the main legal challenge ended up being proving to the courts that my relatives who died in the Holocaust were actually dead. So it ended up being this like very challenging, very weird, sort of surreal legal / bureaucratic challenge. And the other part is, I would call it like the moral or ethical challenge of like, what does it mean to reclaim? And so like, what does it mean to confront the people who actually live in this building? And so, one of the things is I actually felt so awkward about it that I ended up developing actually quite close relationships with the people in the building, who were unbelievably open to me. And then again, another spoiler, I spent 2 years sort of like building relationships with them before I found out I was in the wrong building. And so, I mean, which again, this sort of narrative is built on like the narrative is really propelled by errors. My mistakes, my lawyer's mistakes, a typo in one of like a document from the 50s, sort of the residents sort of misleading me, or I'm misleading myself, or I don't understand the law. And just like the narrative just is propelled by these sort of misunderstandings, or I would even say on the other side, sort of like understanding it better. And so that you're inching closer. And so that is like one sort of like spine of the book, is this my attempts to reclaim the property. And that just starts like sprawling off into all these sort of really unexpected questions and unexpected challenges and unexpected characters. The other sort of narrative through line of the book, which is harder to explain, but I'm going to try. If by show of hands, do people remember from 2015? So there was very brief but very prominent news report about something called the Golden Train. People don't remember. Okay. So I'm sure you saw it at the time. It was major news, but then it sort of disappeared, especially for people who are sort of like interested in World War II. This absolutely made it across your screens at one point. In 2015, a couple of so-called treasure hunters, and so these are people reported in the media as treasure hunters, announced to the world that they had discovered something called the Golden Train. And the Golden Train was an ostensibly legendary train full of looted Nazi gold that they had moved from Wrocław, which was then Breslau, part of Germany, moving it towards Berlin. So according to legend, they had 40-something crates full of gold looted from mostly Jewish inhabitants in Poland. And they were moving it to Berlin, and all of a sudden, for strange reasons, the train gets hijacked or diverted, and they park it underneath a mountain in the Owl Mountains in Silesia, and hide it and bury it. Now, from almost immediately after the war, this train, this legend, is like people are searching for it. There's rumors about it. There's origin stories. This person helped, that person helped. Until in 2015, these two guys claimed to find it. At the time, I heard this story. I was in graduate school actually for fiction. And I thought this would be like a sensational sort of set piece for my thesis novel. And so I went, I hired a guide, a sort of like a very prominent journalist, this wonderful woman who's like, she's a journalist. They call her the queen of the treasure hunters. And so her name is Joanna, and I hired her to be my guide to these sites and also to the treasure hunter community. And the one thing I have to mention about this, and you'll see how this all gets back to me personally, is that where the train is buried and sort of like, oh, sorry, let me tell you a little bit about the treasure hunter community first. The treasure hunter community is a very strange subculture, mostly located in Southeast Poland. And subculture might be a little bit of an understatement. It's about between 100 and 200,000 participants. And this ranges from, I would say, like, you know, you have like the weekend treasure hunters who go out with their metal detectors with their buddies and a couple of cans of beer, to, on the other end of the spectrum, extremely sophisticated, sometimes even sponsored expedition groups using high-end equipment like magnetometers or radar or LiDAR or excavations. And so what are they looking for? They are looking for treasure, sort of, but it's beyond that. I would say they're very interested in sort of what they call mystery. And so mystery encompasses like unanswered questions, mostly relating to World War II. And so like, what happened in this space? What happened in this structure? What is this thing? So they're looking for stuff, but I'd say more than that, they're looking for answers. And at the center of this culture of mystery is something called Project Riza. And so I'll show you photos of Project Riza, but I'll explain what they are first. So one of the strangest infrastructure projects of World War II were these 7 that we know of, 7 underground complexes dug by the Nazis using mostly Jewish slave labor towards the end of the war. And so people often call them tunnels, but tunnels is a misnomer because none of them are finished, but the ones that's closer to completion are enormous. We're talking square miles. We're talking some like could be, 1,000 or 2,000 feet long corridors, 20, 30, 50, sometimes 60 feet tall ceilings, they're subterranean neighborhoods. And so, you see these and it sort of like challenges your conception that, oh, maybe they did hide a train down here. It really sort of throttles your imagination. And so I'll show you some photos from the first time I went there. So when I hired my guide, she brought me to these tunnels. A few of them are open to the public, and a few of them you just have to know the GPS. And so let me open. Okay, and so let me share my screen. Share screen. People could see that, right?
Yeah.
So this is one of the tunnels that's open to the public. All these were taken by a photographer friend of mine who was traveling with me called Riza. So this is you can't get a sense of scale from this, but from where the photographer is standing to you see that tiny little orange square kind of in the center. I think it's something like I like 300 feet long. And so these are enormous. This is one from the first one I went into called Sabone, which is the smallest one. Absolutely not open to the public. Kind of dangerous to go into. You have to sort of like lay down on your stomach and sort of waddle in, and you have to have waders because the water will come up to your chest. Weirdly, the treasure hunter I was with lit a candle there in memoriam, he said, for the prisoners. Again, these are more of these photos. This is also from Sabone. These are original wooden A-frames. So these were there while the prisoners worked on this. In this one, again, this ceiling is over 60 feet tall, just to give you a sense of how big this is. And here's some more. And so there's some of them are closer to finished. And so here you could see some of the reinforced concrete. And there's another one. This is from Sabon, the one that's flooded. And so, yeah. And so I'm still getting to how all this intersects with me. I'm almost there. This is, again, I told you it's a zany story. But it's worth it. Now, what makes Riza, you could see how strange Riza is. It's just a very bizarre Nazi infrastructure project. What makes it truly enigmatic is that there is no primary source as to what the Nazis were planning to do with it. We do not have any sort of like totally authentic, authoritative sources that the Nazis were why they wanted to build it. So you can imagine a very strange sort of like conspiracy theory-ish culture has sort of accreted around these tunnels. Now we could talk about the conspiracy theories later. The most research-intensive chapter in my book by far was trying to understand the conspiracy theories. And so they'll have stuff like time travel, flying saucers, stuff that somehow they were related to Nazi bases on the moon. Very strange. There are more sober, responsible theories, which were they were probably an underground factory. But all this was to say that the Riza, these tunnels are like a very, very important place for the treasure hunters. I would say it's sort of like their spiritual, I don't know, I don't want to say it's tricky to describe. It's sort of like they just take it very, very seriously. And sort of like this sort of the community of treasure hunters who are obsessed with mystery, these are the most mysterious places. And so when I first met the treasure hunters, and they took me to these sites, and I found it very strange, very unusual, very wild. And so on that very first trip, they showed it to me, and then we went and we just were relaxing. We were just we went to get a beer at a local restaurant. And at that time, I was like, maybe I'll write a novel about this. I certainly wasn't thinking that I would write anything personal. And so I was just asking them kind of softball questions, just really trying to get a sense of their character. Like, what's your job? Who are you guys? What have you ever found? Stuff like that. And then I had a friend with me, another writer named Maya, who has a lot more chutzpah than I do. And she asked a question that I wouldn't have had the chutzpah to ask. And she said, it's very cool and very macho, because they're very macho. They have like all these camouflage, they have big beefy mustaches, they have all these very fancy expedition gear. They drive these like safari Land Rovers. It's a very macho culture. And so I asked them, it's very, you guys are clearly, it's very interesting and all this, but what about the fact that 14,000 Jews died digging these tunnels? Because these weren't just a site of adventure or a site of infrastructure. They were using Jewish slave labor, and with tremendous death and attrition and starvation. And so they were rotating Jewish slaves in and out, all from the Gross Rosen network. And approximately, we don't know exactly, but approximately 14,000 Jews died. And so we asked this question, and they immediately got very defensive, or they started talking very, very quickly in Polish. I do not speak Polish, so I don't know what they were saying. But, I've been doing this a long time. And so what you do at those instances is you wait. So I sort of sat back. I waited until there's a conversation petered out, until I could ask Joanna, who was translating for me, what were they talking about? But while I was listening to the Polish, I heard my last name. Now, they didn't know my last name, so they weren't talking about me. And so I heard it, and I don't know if you've ever had experience like this where you unexpectedly hear your last name in a weird context. You're like, what did I hear what I just heard? And so I sort of perked up, and then I started listening. I listened a little more closely, and then they said it again. And I was like, I'm pretty sure they're saying Kaiser. And then they said it again, and I'm like, okay, they're definitely saying my name. I sort of interrupted. I said, what's going on? Like, what's Kaiser? Why are you saying this? And they said, what do you mean? We're talking about Abraham Kaiser. You don't know who Abraham Kaiser is? I'm like, I don't know who Abraham Kaiser is. And then he said, and this is a quote, he said, Abraham Kaiser was one of the most important people to come out of the war, Jew or Pole. And now, hanging out with a rural Pole, hearing a sentiment like that was extraordinary. You do not hear sentiments like that very often. And they explained that Abraham Kaiser was one of those Jewish slave laborers who wrote a diary. And the diary itself is like a really incredible story. He ended up stealing scraps of cement packaging and scribbling his notes before burying them under the latrine. Then after the war, he went and retrieved all these notes, and he turns it into a memoir with the help from a Polish editor, and it's published in Poland in the early 60s. And this diary has become the most important text for the treasure hunters, and Abraham himself has become a mythological figure among the treasure hunter community. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. And I told them, I was like, hey, my name is Kaiser. And they're like, wow, really? Do you think you're related? And I was like, where's this Kaiser from? And they said, oh, he's from Łódź. And I said, oh, I guess not. I get, okay. My family's from Sosnowiec. Łódź is like 7 hours away. I guess not. I guess it's just a coincidence. And so, we went away. And then the next day, I went to one of those sites, one of those tunnels. But this one was the biggest one. And this one is run kind of like a national park. So that you come in, there's parking, there's a cafe, there are tour guides, and there's a gift shop. And at the gift shop, I saw this memoir by Abraham Kaiser. It's called Za Drzwiami Śmierci, which means Behind the Wires of Death. And they were just selling it because, again, this is a book that is just consumed by this community. And I bought it. I bought it as a kind of a funny souvenir because I couldn't read it. It was all in Polish. But that night, I was just sort of had nothing else to do. And I was just flipping through the book. And I saw that the first line, there was a preface written by the museum staff, like kind of a scholarly preface, an introduction to who this Abraham Kaiser was. And even I could read the first line because there was a lot of proper nouns in there. And that said, Abraham Kaiser was born in 1914 in Będzin, not Łódź, in Będzin. Now, Będzin is the city adjacent to Sosnowiec. In fact, they shared a ghetto. It's basically like it's one large metropolitan area. And I said, well, this changes the nature of that coincidence. And so what I did that night is I scanned that introduction with my phone, and I uploaded it, and I Google translated it. And there was a lot of biographical information, and I was able to build a family tree. And then I went and took the documents I had got from my lawyer, we had also to build a family tree to see what other heirs there were for the building. And that night I discovered that not only was my family not extinct, as we were always told growing up, that no one survived except my grandfather, none of his siblings, no one, but this in fact was his closest surviving relative. It was his first cousin. And so that night, like the family, the way I write is my family went from extinct to not extinct. And so this became, it was very sort of thrilling for my family, but it was even more thrilling for the treasure hunters. And so over the next few years, I hung out with the treasure hunter community. I became kind of a mascot for them. So they were sort of like so moved, and I don't know. It had a big effect on them that Abraham Kaiser's grandson. Now, I wasn't the grandson, but they sort of went with that story, and I couldn't convince them otherwise. That Abraham Kaiser's grandson, that was part of this. And so this again is a long introduction to what that other through line of the book is. There's the building, and then there's a treasure hunter community, and sort of like the sort of moral and legal and like the narrative questions that kind of spill out from over those two. And there's a lot of, very surprising tangents that happen. Like I end up finding the family of the woman who saved Abraham. And that's been another entire subplot. Or the story of the diary itself is very sort of to me, I found it very enthralling. And so, yeah, but that really is my grand overview of what the book is about. And so at that point, I guess we could open up to, I don't know, questions or discussions, or I'm happy. Also, I'll just really hand it back to David at this point.
Okay. So it was as fate would have it, it was 7 years ago this week that the Polish government passed those laws assaulting the Polish judicial system that made it ever more difficult for you to pursue this quest. And then, of course, there was a trial that happened a week after that, right? And
So yeah, I'll explain a little. There's reclamation is sort of it's a mushy word a little bit, and so it's the government made it much more difficult, has always made it very difficult to reclaim buildings. My case isn't technically a reclamation because we still own it. So my legal challenges were two-pronged. One is I had to go to the city and sort of get them to update their registry. So there's no question that we own that building in 1932. Now, but right now, the building is kind of technically ownerless. So no one can buy it or sell it because there's no the buyers are not around. So I needed to get the city to sort of recognize that the people, whoever used to own it, still owns it, which is the law. It's just sort of, it is a legal challenge. And the other one is an inheritance procedure, which is saying, oh, my great-grandfather, he's dead. And so his heirs, they inherited it, but now they're dead. And so their heirs. Now, this ended up being very, very difficult because they died in the Holocaust and we didn't know where or when or how. And so they certainly didn't die. They weren't granted death certificates. And so I had to sort of petition the courts to grant them death certificates, which ended up being not simple. And so not simple at all. It ended up being an interesting question of, were the judges screwing me over? Was my lawyer inept? Was there like a simple typo? And being a very tricky question to navigate. And so it's a little bit different than the regular reclamation. If someone has taken the deed of the house or the property, it's nearly impossible. And then there was what David's referring to in 2015 is there was a in 2015, a new government came to power, the Law and Justice Party, which was a far-right, revisionist, very Catholic, very nationalist party. And their first sort of attack on on certain democratic institutions were the overhaul of the judiciary. And there were certain things that were implemented which made it very, very difficult to know how the judges were acting. And then 1 week later, I had my first trial, which I showed up in court dealing with the judge, and it was very hard to understand her motivations or whether I could trust her independence.
so that was 2017, right?
The 2017, yeah.
Do you have a picture accessible that will show our audience what the building looks like? If not, that's okay.
I'm on the wrong. Yeah, if people are very curious, I could send them the correct building and the incorrect building.
Okay. So in the book, you haven't reclaimed this property, and Simone Gorko is asking whether you ever did get the building back.
So, no, there was. It's still going. It's still going. But this is sort of par for the course. And so it's been 8 or 9 years, depending how you count. And it's still going. After the book came out, I was really interested because the book came out in Polish. And I was like, oh, maybe the book coming out in Polish will torpedo my efforts to reclaim the building, which would be annoying in terms of reclamation, but kind of perfect from a story point of view, where the thing you write about, the book ends up destroying its own mission. I found that to be kind of a poetic ending, but that didn't happen. Not long after the book came out, the city attempted to seize the property, which what's it called? Like eminent domain, basically. By by claiming that we hadn't acted within 30 years and had thus relinquished our rights. Now, it was clearly not true because it hadn't been 30 years. They started counting from 1990. My papers were in by 2016. So that it was just not true. I actually found it was actually great. I actually was very happy that they made this attempt for two reasons. One, this was the first time that the city was formally acknowledging that the building was ours. So like that is like we knew that before, but this was an acknowledgement that like if they had to seize it, it meant they had to seize it from us. And two, I was like, it ended up being, and like we learned a little bit more. It ended up being not quite the city, which was unclear. It's ended up being like someone pressuring a city to do this kind of perfunctory legal maneuver, which ended up just wasn't, it's just not valid. So it didn't go anywhere. But I was like, you know, through the course of the whole book, one of the questions I struggle with is I not really understanding the motivations of the people I'm working against. And so that's the judges, that's the residents, like who are they trying to screw me over, or is this sort of regular bureaucracy? And I found that to be a really challenging question to navigate. And I was like, if they actually just seize it, then that question is decided. To me, that was sort of a conclusive ending. I will say the building ended up being much more valuable than I thought it would be coming in. That's sort of an important point. Coming in, like we just made assumptions, which were, you know, we just thought, oh, it's not that small of a city. That's the truth. I think we assumed it was a smaller city than it was, and we thought the building wouldn't be worth as much, but it was. The building is probably worth between, I don't know now, between maybe $600,000 and $900,000. So it's like it's actually valuable. And my lawyer, you know, not the most professional lawyer, but very cheap. So sort of like the legal costs have been totally manageable for these years. So yeah, but it's still absolutely ongoing. Like next, I'm driving to Toronto this week. I'm gonna pick up my aunt's birth certificate. You know, I had to get original birth certificates. This is like, again, 8 years in. And so it moves, but it's slow.
Are you still working with the killer?
Yep. Yeah, totally. Yeah. I think that, like, you know, at a certain point when I thought my lawyer's messed up in the book, I actually hire another lawyer to explain my lawyer to me. Like, because I didn't know if my lawyer was a real lawyer. So I needed another lawyer to lawyer explain. And they explained, they're like, look, they're old school. They're, you know, but it's not Warsaw, it's not Krakow. It's a much smaller municipal court. This is sort of how it works. They're doing the job. So I was like, okay, I guess, I mean, I'm kind of committed to her. I hope she's still alive. Like I haven't been in touch with her in a few months, but yeah, we're still going.
So the book is divided into four parts, plus an epilogue. The first part, where the reader is very quickly introduced to the disarming, I think, and unusual conversational tone of this writer, and it introduces his search for this building. And the second part is about these, let's call them tunnels, which is known as the RISA project. The third part introduces the property that was the property that he really was in search of when he originally thought he was in search of a different property on the same street. And then the final part, which is very moving, has to do with this memoir of Abraham Kaiser, which Menachem found in the gift shop. I can't recommend this book highly enough. I know it's been 3 years since it came out. It's won a very prestigious award. Uh, but it's written in such a compelling way that I really encourage all 21 participants in this call to go out and get a copy of this book. Now, Menachem, for the sake of our Philadelphia audience, these folks can actually be helpful to you, right? You're looking for somebody named Delphiner who's in Philadelphia, and that's in connection with your latest work, right?
If anyone knows, yeah, it's related. I think also just some people ask questions on the side that I just want to address quickly. Is the book is definitely nonfiction. I started it. I started researching this book or thinking about this book while I was writing fiction, but this book is absolutely fiction. And did I get the building back? I answered that. Was anything found in the tunnels? Yes. Back that first of all, not all the tunnels have been excavated. Some of them are still closed off and are awaiting sort of big government expeditions. They found stuff. I like not like treasure. They found stuff. And so there would be like old weapons, maybe a weapon cache or building materials. I don't know if they found anything like super secret. Stuff has been found though by the treasure hunters, or often there have been actual treasures found. Usually it's when people renovate their houses in certain parts of Poland. And so they find like some remarkable thing, usually from medieval era. I've seen photos of gold that has been found. I've never seen it in person, but very much more famously in the years after the war, from like 45 to like 49, huge amounts of gold was found. And so it's one of these stories that really appeals to me because it's sort of a mythology that grew out of a real history, which is I've always found really interesting to try and parse like how a seed of a truth could become something that's much stranger. So yeah, happy to answer any other questions about it. And then it's Delphiner. Yeah, I am writing a story. I'm writing a new book that mostly takes place in Montreal, but one of the relatives is the golden train ever found. The golden train was not found. Someone asked if the golden train found. The story is, I think, one of the most interesting and it's never really been told, actually, the story of the golden train. So basically what happened in 2015, these guys claim there's a golden train, and what's very bizarre is that the whole world believes it. And so you had massive media presence for a few months, just like New York Times, Fox News, BBC. Everyone descends on the small village, very depressed village called Babje. And they're like, we're going to find it. We're going to do it. And then they brought in the military. They brought in the university researchers. They did a massive dig, and there was no train. There was no train. And it's one of these really interesting reasons why did everyone believe it? And again, so this goes back to these things which I'm really interested. There's just something so compelling about stories of Nazi treasure that kind of destroy our skepticism. We're just so, yeah.
Karen Wisnia has a question. Karen, yeah, there you go.
Hi, thank you so much for your wonderful description of the book. It sounds really fascinating. So my father was from Sochaczew. I'm not sure exactly how to say it correctly, but he was in Auschwitz, and when he went back after the war, I don't know the story specifically when. Sorry, there's a trolley going by. He went back to the house where he was raised, and they had, he said, renumbered the street, and that this was done intentionally so that people couldn't come back and claim their property. And that he went up to the house and he was kind of like, looking at it. And I'm not sure if one time he actually went back and they knocked on the door, and it seemed that once he mentioned that he used to live there, they pretty much like slammed the door in his face. They were very afraid that he was going to try to get back his property or whatever. But when he said that they renumbered, and I wondered if that's had something to do with why you thought you had a different building than you had.
So it's no. The short answer is no. Basically, what happened was they had constructed the first time I went into the building, like the first real time, like not the first time, but I went back and I brought a photographer and I brought back a translator. I even brought a researcher. The researcher, this Polish researcher, came in. She's like, "This really doesn't feel like a building from 1932." And I was like, "I don't know what to tell you. It's the building from 1932." So she was right. They had constructed, during Soviet times, they constructed a massive block in between, and so they just pushed up the numbers. Now, like, so it was innocent in that sense. Now, I don't know how it works in Sokolichov, but it might be a little bit of a smaller municipality. But the bigger municipalities, I think this is true in most cities, they don't actually care about the address.
Hmm.
It's the lot number. And so like you have the city plan and the lot number stays the same. And so like legally, when I found out it was the wrong building, it actually didn't matter from a legal point of view because I was like, still the plot was correct. It's just the address had changed. But it would really, from a sentimental point of view, it really like sent my head spinning because again, I had sort of like, I was like, this is the building. I feel something here. These people, like they're in my family, like my patrimony, da 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 da. And so, but I sort of invented all that sentimental value. But these are, yeah, totally interesting questions. But I can't speak directly to Sokolichov. I just know the municipalities that I'm familiar with.
Menachem, there's a question from the Klymans who are
Oh, I see.
asking, did you seek any assistance from any of the Jewish agencies in attempting to regain ownership of the building?
Not really. There's not so much. Like basically, they can't do. They couldn't push it further than I could, to be honest. And so like the Jewish agencies, or I don't know the agency specific, but like the WJRO or sort of organizations that are involved in restitution, don't very rarely will deal with like private claims. They're dealing with sort of like either institutional or even national level or policy. That's my experience. But every people I reached out to are like, yeah, you're doing what you have to do. Now I was in a better position than most people just because I was spending so much time in Poland, had collected so many documents, and like had a network. So I think for some people who are Dutch, if they need an intermediary, could be the agencies provide. I would be pretty surprised actually if any of the agencies provide the service, but maybe they refer you to a lawyer who can help. And then, is it possible to claim the building without establishing residency in Poland? Yeah, yeah, I think. I mean, it's just like a legal. It's just like a ownership of the building. I think there's become some complicated questions about back taxes, which kind of kick in. I don't know the specifics, but I don't know. I'm not sure. And then, yeah, I don't, if ever, in regards to this, you're looking for, does he live in Philadelphia? There is a Delphiner in Philadelphia. There's a family in the Delphiner greater area. If anyone knows them personally, a guy named Alan Delphiner, but it's not that important.
Well, we're here for you.
I appreciate it.
I told Menachem uh, earlier that there are certain lines in this book that are really a dead giveaway that you're just not reading a normal memoir, but you're reading the work of somebody who is an artist. And here's an example. This is just a random example, actually, from an early part of the book. This is his description of Sosnowiec. Sosnowiec isn't a village, isn't a shtetl, and it isn't picturesque. It is a grim post-industrial city. This is true historically, aesthetically, and atmospherically. The dominant industry in the region for centuries was coal mining, and this can be felt. The city feels grimy, heavy, melancholy. The city feels like a cough. I don't know whether you would find a line like that in very many memoirs. So, again, go out and get this book. Okay, we have one new message. Okay, somebody may have information about the Delphiners, and Judith Deglin will contact you after the program.
Wonderful.
What is the best way for her to do that?
Email. Yeah, David has feel free to pass on my email.
Okay, I will do that. Can you tell us how your family has reacted to the book?
Sure. While I was writing it, I would say, again, so we didn't come from a place where anyone knew anything. And so I think while I was writing it or experiencing it over the course of this like 5 years, I'd come back and say, oh my God, this happened, and we have this relative and the treasure hunters and Golden Train. I'm in this tunnel and this lawsuit and that judge. And so and it was very hard to follow. And so people were like, oh, Menachem's doing some zany stuff in Poland. But when I was able to present it as a book, in a very private way, that book was really for my father, and also for my family. Like in the most private sense, I think when people write a book, at some level, they're writing it for one person. And so like the book was a gift, in a sense, to my father of like, I pushed into this family history. I pushed as far as I could get. There's an irony is that I don't actually learn anything about my grandfather. I don't get closer to him. I do find this sort of alternate grandfather, but this whole world sort of opened up. And I was able to present to my father, like, here is our family history. It's a little bit messy, but like we're telling it in a story. And so I was able to give that to him, which meant a lot to me. It wasn't always easy. There were certain things in the book which, people had a hard time with. And so I will say, you can never predict what people are going to be upset about after you write a book. I was shocked. I think the most special and funniest thing was, I'll say the story quickly because it's just a fun one. They, when I was explaining my family dynamics, because the backdrop to this is there was a huge fight in my family in 2005 where my father and his siblings got into sort of a massive disagreement, didn't speak for 10 years. And so, which again, when I'm dealing with family inheritance is tricky. It's very tricky. So I wrote a scene and when my grandmother died and I was talking about the Shiva. And so I wrote, when they were reading on the Shiva, they wrote low without the cushions and without the plastic cover, which, I said they didn't sit on the plastic cover because my grandmother took it off. So there was no plastic cover. And I wrote in parentheses, if Bubby weren't dead, she'd die, as a joke because there was no plastic cover. And then it ended up being a long story because I made my aunt anonymous and blah, 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 fine. But my aunt ended up reading that chapter before the book came out. And she called my mom and my mother told me she screamed so loud that she got hoarse. And she was so upset, not about the fight or not about that stuff. She was so upset that how dare I say that Bubby had a plastic cover on her sofa. And I was like, I don't know what to tell you. I remember a plastic cover. And so we got into this sort of really high stakes argument of whether or not Bubby covered her sofa with plastic. And she had her evidence and I had my evidence. So I actually took the line out of the book because I'm such a good nephew. But later I wrote an essay about trying to figure out whether or not the sofa was covered. And so I put it in the chat. So that was like a fun sort of aftershock of the book's publication.
Okay,
Yeah. And so,
thank you.
yeah, largely people seemed happy with the book.
Great, as they should,
As they should.
as they should. And you're sharing a link to the Paris Review.
Yeah. So that's just an essay I wrote about this episode in which, I had this disagreement with my aunt. But to me, the most fun part of writing the whole book was like this argument about figuring out whether the sofa was covered.
And there is, as I mentioned to you, Menachem, there's an international conference on Jewish genealogy taking place in Philly, August 18th through the 22nd. I shared the link to that, ihjgs.org, in the chat area.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. As it happens, I'll be speaking there on August 21st. It's taking place at the Sheraton Philadelphia Downtown Hotel,
Mhm.
which formerly was known as the Wyndham Franklin Plaza. Excuse me. Okay. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, well, we thank you so much for doing this. It's been enlightening and it's been a pleasure. And
Great.
I hope you sell 21 more books as a result.
I appreciate that. Yeah. And be in
Absolutely.
touch if people, it's always really fun to hear from readers.
Great.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you
guys.
so much.
David. Thank you, Benat.
Bye.
Good night. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.